Good day. Before I make my video today, I just wanted to update you on certain my travel moves over the next couple of days. Tomorrow, I am flying to Budapest, to Hungary, at the invitation, incidentally, of the Hungarian government, where I and my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou will be together with various other people from various independent and indeed mainstream media outlets be meeting over the course of next week with various senior officials of the Hungarian government. So we will be very, very tied up over the course of next week, but I fully intend to continue to make my videos over the course of next week. And in fact, Alex and I are going to seek to continue to provide videos for the Duran also. However, tomorrow is a travel day. The flight times from London to Budapest are not particularly long, but it will be a busy time in Budapest, and I understand that I'll be going straight from the plane, well, first to the hotel and then into an important meeting. So I'm not sure what sort of a video I'm going to be able to do tomorrow. It may be much shorter than my usual videos, and there is a possibility, though one I hope to avoid, that there might not be a video at all. I will certainly strain every nerve to prevent that from happening. But this is just to let you know, to forewarn you that, as I said, tomorrow I will be on my travels, and this may affect both the nature of the video I produce, its length, and of course the time that it might be published. So with that, let's move on to the subject, the topics of today's video. Now, in my video yesterday, I spoke of the intention. I had the intention of dedicating much of today's video to an in-depth discussion of the military situation in Ukraine. And certainly the military situation in Ukraine most definitely does merit an in-depth discussion. Over the last 2 weeks, as we have been focusing on the election in the United States and the situation in the Middle East and other matters, events on the battlefields in Ukraine have developed very rapidly, very much in Russia's favor, very much contrary to Ukraine's. And given the speed of events and the scale of the changes, it does seem to me that an overview, an in-depth overview of what is going on the battlefronts is certainly merited. Well, that was my intention yesterday, and I still intend at some point to do a program reviewing what is going on the battlefields, reviewing the recent developments, and giving my own opinion as to where we are on the battlefields. But of course, international affairs is always in flux. All kinds of important things happen. Sometimes they may not be quite as important as they first appear, and that might be the case of the event that has, to some extent, brought me back to discussions of diplomatic matters in this video today, rather than that in-depth discussion of the military situation that I had intended. And of course, I'm talking about the telephone conversation between Russian President Putin and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and discuss this conversation. Now, Scholz has not spoken to Putin since December 2022. At various times, the German authorities, and most specifically, and to my knowledge, the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, have given the impression that the reason that there have been no calls or discussions or meetings or conversations between Scholz and Putin since December 2022 is because Putin has not been accepting calls from Western leaders, and he's not been willing to speak to those leaders. He's not been prepared to receive them in Moscow or to meet them in other places. And when they have called, he's kept the phone silent. He's not answered the call. That is what Baerbock has said. Baerbock has also said at various times that the Russians, Putin to be precise, have shown no interest in negotiations or at any rate discussions on the topic of Ukraine. Well, over the last couple of months, in fact, basically since Baerbock and others have been making that claim, Putin himself and various Russian officials have gone out of their way to say that all of this is completely untrue. Putin has never refused a call from any Western leader. If any Western leader wants to speak to him, he's absolutely ready to answer the telephone and to engage that leader in an in-depth discussion. If any Western leader wants to visit him in Moscow, they are welcome to do so. Even if they want to meet him in some third country, well, he's up for that too. And as the Russians repeatedly say and point out, they have never refused negotiations over the conflict in Ukraine. They engaged the Ukrainians in negotiations in February, March, early April 2022. They thought they had come to an agreement with the Ukrainians at that time. It was not their fault that the Ukrainians then walked away from the agreement. The Russians, as I well remember, sent various messages to Kiev in the weeks that followed, right up until about June, July, asking the Ukrainians would they respond to various Russian messages intended to take the negotiations forward. The Ukrainians failed to respond to those messages, and in fact, so far from it being the Russians who refused to talk, it was the Ukrainians who in September 2022, President Zelensky himself specifically, passed a decree prohibiting negotiations with the Russians so long as President Putin remained Russia's president. So that was not the Russians who refused negotiations. And ever since that decision of the Ukrainians to prohibit themselves from engaging in talks, the Russians have nonetheless still repeatedly said that they are prepared to talk to the Ukrainians, though not without conditions. It is the Ukrainians who refuse negotiations. As we will see, Zelensky is still doing so. In fact, about 2 weeks ago, as I remember, Zelensky actually said that though he did want a diplomatic solution to the Ukraine war, he wanted that diplomatic solution to be achieved without actual negotiations taking place. He simply wanted the Russians to basically capitulate to his demands, something which, of course, the Russians will never do. And with respect to calls from Olaf Scholz or any Western leader, be it Scholz or Macron or the various people who have at various times been prime ministers of Britain, and of course also with respect to the US President Joe Biden, Putin has never at any time said that he's not prepared to speak to these people. So anyway, Scholz himself has at various times floated the possibility of calling Putin. He's discussed this ever since that last conversation the two had back in December 2022. And at various times he said that he would be prepared to speak to Putin though the time for that would have to be right. Now, in the summer, I think it was in August, we had another big flurry of rumours coming from Berlin that Scholz was intending to call Putin at that time. This was when it became clear that the Russians were achieving a major breakthrough on the Ukrainian battlefronts. Well, there were rumours that Scholz was preparing to call Putin, but in the event he failed to do so. And then about a week ago, we started to get rumours that Scholz again was intending to call Putin. And it was very strange because Scholz said that the timing now was right to call Putin. He didn't really explain why that would be the case, why that was the case. But of course, two events have actually happened over the last 2 weeks, which perhaps have concentrated the mind in Berlin. One is the collapse of the German government, the traffic light coalition, and the imminent elections which are due to take place in Germany, which are widely expected to happen in February. And, of course, the election of Donald Trump in the United States. Now, note that Scholz has not, as far as I know, directly linked his call to either of these events. And Scholz almost certainly is also influenced by the latest military developments as well. Anyway, yesterday, finally, Scholz did call Putin. And the Russians, as always, have provided us with a very, very thorough readout. And I will think the first proper way to discuss this call is to start with that Russian readout, which is very interesting. Anyway, the readout reads as follows. Telephone conversation with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And we're told that this took place on the 15th of November at 1810 hours Moscow time. In other words, in the late afternoon, early evening. And the first I'm going to say before I proceed to discuss the readout in detail that its tone is extremely stiff and cold. One gets the sense of deep anger on the Russian side, even though the language of the readout is very measured. But as I said, there's not a glimmer of warmth anywhere in this readout. And as we will also see over the course of the telephone call, Vladimir Putin didn't give an inch. Not an inch, he didn't give a fraction of a millimeter. Anyway, let's read what the Kremlin is saying that the two leaders said to each other. President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, had a telephone conversation with Federal Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Olaf Scholz, held for the first time since December 2022 at the initiative of the German side. Now, that is already a rather cold, almost rude way to start a readout like this. First of all, there's the pointed reminder that the Germans haven't spoken to the Russians since December 2022, with a clear implication, which, as I said, the Russians have repeatedly confirmed, and which I have no doubt is true, that the reason there have been no interactions between the Germans and the Russians since December 2022 is because that has been the decision of the German side. And then, of course, the rest of the sentence says that the conversation that took place yesterday happened at the initiative of the German side. In other words, it was the Germans who asked for the call. Now, obviously, when two leaders speak to each other, there's always, by definition, going to be one side that is going to ask for the call first. But as I have discussed and explained many times, it is unusual and even slightly discourteous to state in a readout of a conversation between leaders that it was the other side that requested the call. It makes the other side look as if they are begging for a conversation from the side that is providing the readout. It puts them in a subtly inferior position. And all of those who had experience in diplomatic matters are familiar with this fact. Anyway, the readout then goes on to say this: the leaders had an in-depth and frank exchange of views on the situation in Ukraine. So, an in-depth and frank exchange of views. The key word here is frank, because as, again, people familiar with especially Russian diplomatic practice will know, way back since Soviet times, the 1940s even, when first the Soviets and now the Russians talk about a full and frank exchange of views, or in this case, an in-depth and frank exchange of views, you are told, the readout says, that there has been complete disagreement between the two sides, that the conversation has been rather heated, and in fact, sometimes the words full and frank exchange of views, or in-depth and frank exchange of views, as in this case, are euphemisms for a row. Now, I'm not saying that that was the case here. I don't think that there were probably raised voices. I'm sure that the conversation on this occasion took place in a measured and courteous way. After all, it's not as if Scholz and Putin are not familiar with each other's positions. But, again, the words in-depth and frank exchange of views tell us that there was no meeting of minds on the topic of the conflict, on the situation in Ukraine, that the Russians set out their positions firmly and fully and made Scholz unambiguously aware of what they are. And, of course, the next sentence then goes to confirm this. Vladimir Putin reiterated that the current crisis was a direct result of NATO's long-standing aggressive policy aimed at creating a staging ground against Russia on Ukrainian soil, while showing disregard for Russia's security concerns and trampling on the rights of Russian-speaking residents of Ukraine. Now, that has been the Russian position all along. It was already, to some extent, set out in the Minsk agreements, or at least in the language that the Russians used at the time that the Minsk agreements were made. It's been reiterated ever since with ever-growing force. It is now clearly the official Russian position. And the words that must stand out here are NATO's long-standing aggressive policy. Now, the word aggressive, again, is a very, very strong word. When one side in a conversation between leaders of nations accuses the other side, and of course Scholz is a leader of a NATO country, when the other side is accused of aggression, that is almost a statement that the other side not only is responsible for the whole crisis, but has to all intents and purposes, committed something not far short of a crime. Of course, aggression in international law is a crime against peace. And here we see Putin speaking about an aggressive policy aimed at creating a staging ground against Russia on Ukrainian soil. And he says clearly that this is NATO policy. Bring Ukraine into NATO, arm Ukraine, establish missile bases there, threaten Russia, and do so in a way that shows disregard for Russian security concerns, and also, and now he has brought in this human rights dimension, which the Russians are increasingly returning to. I discussed that in my program yesterday when I discussed the interview that Lavrov has recently given, trampling on the rights of Russian-speaking residents of Ukraine, denying them the right to speak their own language, to live their own culture. The Russians see that as a violation of the rights of these people. The Russians don't use the words human rights because, of course, that is Western language that they prefer to avoid, but they are emphasizing the fact that the rights of the Russian-speaking residents of Ukraine are being violated. And in this sentence, Putin is making it clear that this is a direct byproduct of NATO policy. By seeking to extend NATO influence into Ukraine, by seeking to convert Ukraine into an anti-Russian state equipped with NATO weapons, including long-range missiles, and by bringing Ukraine into NATO in that kind of way, NATO, by definition, is supporting those anti-Russian elements inside Ukraine, political forces inside Ukraine, which, again, by definition, are going to seek to violate the rights of the Russian-speaking residents of Ukraine. Anyway, the Russian readout then continues in the same, following the same tone. Speaking on the prospects of reaching a political and diplomatic settlement of the conflict, the president of Russia pointed out that the Russian side had never rejected and was still open to resuming the talks broken off by the Kiev regime. So that sentence conveys two things. Firstly, those claims by Annalena Baerbock and others that the Russians are not interested in negotiations or are not prepared to engage in negotiations are untrue. It is false to say that. The Germans, of course, Baerbock is, after all, Germany's foreign minister, have been saying that, and they have been intentionally spreading false claims about what the Russians were prepared to do. And, of course, it was not the Russians who broke off the talks. The Russians are prepared to resume the talks. So it was the Ukrainians who are not prepared to negotiate because they walked away from the Istanbul process. But when Putin, or rather the Kremlin, talks about resuming the talks broken off by the Kiev regime, what Putin is again saying is that if talks between Ukraine and Russia are going to take place, they must be continuations of the Istanbul process. Any new process, any new format, like the various peace conferences that Zelensky is trying to organize, are unacceptable to the Russians. The Russians are not going to simply write off the whole Istanbul process and pretend that Ukraine did not agree to the various things it agreed to in Istanbul. Any further discussion between Russia and Ukraine to end the war has to be based and built upon what was already agreed between the two sides in Istanbul. And then the rest of the readout, the next sentence makes that last point completely clear. Russia's proposals are well known and have been outlined in particular in the president's speech at the Foreign Ministry in June. So the basis has to be Istanbul plus. Nothing else. That was what Putin said when he spoke to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June. Any possible agreements must address security concerns of the Russian Federation, rest on the new territorial realities, and must importantly eliminate the original causes of the conflict. Any possible agreements must address security concerns of the Russian Federation. No NATO, no Western troops in Ukraine, restrictions on support for Ukraine by the Western powers, no military exercises involving Western troops in Ukraine, limited supplies, if any supplies at all, of weapons to the Ukrainian army, all of that sort of thing. Strong security guarantees, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia also. Rest on the new territorial realities. The four regions plus Crimea are not any longer a topic of discussion. They are Russia, and that is the end of it. And most importantly, eliminate the original causes of the conflict. NATO efforts to expand into Ukraine must cease. And of course, by definition and consequentially, the results of the Maidan events of 2013, 2014, the coming to power of the Maidan movement, what Putin and the Russians refer to as the Maidan coup of February 2014. That must all be reversed, and what is left of Ukraine must become not only neutral, fully neutral and demilitarized, but must return to a political structure not significantly different from the one it had before the 2014 coup took place, save, of course, that the nationalist forces, the ultra-nationalist forces, the followers of the ideology of the 1930s, who were responsible for the Maidan coup of 2014, they must be removed one way or the other from the political scene. It's absolutely clear what the Russians are seeking. As Putin said, it's all set out in what Ukraine largely agreed to in Istanbul in April 2022. The Russians will probably now want to go beyond that, and we'll discuss how they might do so in a moment. And of course, over and above that, the new territorial realities, the four regions as part of Russia, Crimea as part of Russia, that must be accepted as well. Anyway, so that was Ukraine. On the Ukrainian conflict, Putin didn't give an inch. He made his position and Russia's position completely clear. And it is also clear, incidentally, that there can be no basis of any settlement of the conflict in Ukraine on the part of any sort of freeze. The Russians are looking for a permanent, sustained conclusion to this conflict, one which will not just provide an interval, a further interval between the war we have now and the next war which is to follow. Anyway, the readout then continues. The discussion also touched on the state of affairs in relation between Russia and Germany. Vladimir Putin noted their unprecedented decline in all areas caused by the unfriendly policy pursued by the German authorities. Olaf Scholz, it's your fault. It was emphasized that Russia had always honored its commitments under various treaties and contracts in the energy sector. Scholz has at various times has claimed that it was the Russians who cut off supplies of gas to Germany. Putin is going out of his way to say that is completely untrue. When you're saying this, you are deceiving the German people. We consistently fulfilled our contractual obligations. And then Putin reminds Scholz, we're still willing to promote mutually beneficial cooperation if the German side shows interest in it. In other words, we can resume supplies of gas to Germany, but the decision about that is yours. We're not refusing, despite and contrary to what you say, to supply you with gas, but you will have to change your stance and your approach. You will have to exercise a 180-degree turn. You will have to go back to the situation which existed before February 2022, and it is entirely your fault that things have gone so badly wrong between us, with all of the consequences for Germany, for its economy, for the living standards of the German people, which you, of course, know. And then we have two concluding paragraphs. Recent escalations in the Middle East were also addressed. Vladimir Putin informed Olaf Scholz on the efforts made by Russia to de-escalate and seek peaceful solutions for the regional crisis. Notice that there is no criticism here of Iran. When Western leaders speak to each other and discuss the Middle East, there are always at least ritual criticisms of Iran made. The Russians are having none of it. I would be interested to know, by the way, which of these two leaders, Putin or Scholz, it was who brought up the topic of the Middle East. I'm going to make a guess. I suspect it was the Russians. The Russians are again making it clear to the Germans and to the other Western powers that they think that Western policy is not facilitating a return to stability in the Middle East. Anyway, I'm not going to spend more time on that. And then there's the very last sentence, about which, by the way, German reporting and much reporting in the West also appears to me to be misleading. This is what the very last sentence says. The leaders agreed that following their telephone conversation, their aides would keep in touch. Now, there's been much reporting, and it's been said in Germany, that Scholz and Putin agreed to stay in touch with each other, that they would remain in contact, the implication being that they might at some point have a follow-up call. Well, that is not what this sentence says. There's no hint here that the Russians expect to be speaking to Scholz again. Maybe it will happen, as the Russians have said, if Scholz wants to call them, of course they will speak to him, whilst he remains Chancellor. But perhaps he won't be Chancellor for very long. After all, there's going to be elections in Germany, most likely in February. And in the meantime, it's likely that next week, Olaf Scholz's government is going to lose a vote of confidence in the Bundestag. So given that this is so, perhaps there may not be any follow-up conversation between the Russians and Scholz. And the Russians, Putin, are not particularly keen on such a conversation. They didn't ask for this conversation, which has just happened. It's up to Scholz, ultimately, whether there is going to be another conversation or not. But certainly Putin hasn't agreed to one in advance. He's not said that he's looking forward to speaking with Scholz again. All the Russians have agreed to is that the aides of the two leaders, their aides, would keep in touch. Presumably Yuri Ushakov from the Russian side, who is Putin's main foreign policy aide, and whoever advises Scholz on foreign policy on the German side. So various claims that you see circulating in the media in the West that the two leaders agreed to maintain contacts and to speak to each other again are not actually borne out by the wording of the Russian readout. This is a very, very tough readout. What one could say is that Putin threw the book at Scholz. He said to him, "You're to blame for the whole crisis. NATO is to blame for the whole crisis. You wanted to expand NATO into Ukraine. We told you not to. You ignored our security concerns, despite us giving you repeated warnings that you shouldn't and that we would react as you did, if you did. You engineered a seizure of power in Ukraine, which has made this whole situation far, far worse. You have looked the other way, even as your Ukrainian proxies have trampled on the rights of our people, Russian people in Ukraine, and subsequently, and on top of all of that, you have completely destroyed the economic and energy relationship that existed between our two countries, which took decades to build up and which was so much in your own interests and which underpinned your prosperity. And now you come wanting to talk to us, but the fact that there has been an in-depth and frank exchange of views tells us that you've not really changed your approach. You stick to the same positions as you had before, taking everything, meaning that there is no reason to think that things will get any better. As I said, this is a very, very tough readout. Now, to get a sense of how tough this readout is, consider a conversation that Putin had 2 days earlier with MBS Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is also the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia. That, by contrast, was a very friendly call. And just for contrast, I will read out the Kremlin's readout here. Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, at the latter's initiative. It's slightly different because we're told that it was the initiative of the Saudis, but they didn't actually beg for the call in quite the same way. And then listen to this. Listen to this. The parties expressed satisfaction with the current level of the friendly and mutually beneficial ties between Russia and Saudi Arabia, and reaffirmed their commitment to continue the consistent expansion of political, trade, economic and humanitarian links. They stressed the importance of continuing close cooperation within OPEC. Plus, by the way, the reason this call has happened almost certainly is because the Saudis have been concerned about the recent slide in oil prices, and they want to coordinate perhaps production freezes or production cuts, or at least to discuss this with the other major oil exporters, one of which, of course, is Russia. So that's probably the reason for this call. But anyway, they stressed the importance of continuing close coordination with OPEC Plus and stated the effectiveness and timeliness of the steps being taken in this format to ensure balance on the global energy market. The President and the Prime Minister discussed the complicated situation in the zone of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and noted that the principled approaches, that they are people of principled approaches of Russia and Saudi Arabia with regard to the Middle East are essentially identical. The parties also shared their opinions on the successful BRICS summit in Kazan and agreed to maintain contact. Here we see that they are going to maintain contact. We are being told this time that the two leaders do, at some point, intend to have further interactions with each other. That is a friendly readout. The one with Scholz is not. The Russians are furious with him. They're not making any effort to conceal the fact. Putin threw the book at him. And that then brings us back to Scholz. Why did he call Putin at this time? Well, we have had German accounts of this conversation. They're all over the place because, as is often the case, the Germans have provided their readout, but they have also given lots of interviews. And we are told that Scholz's spokesman, I'm taking this from Financial Times, Stefan Hebestreit, said that the German leader condemned the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and called on President Putin to end it and withdraw his troops. An absurd thing to say at this stage of the war. If Scholz really did make a comment like that, the Russians will have seen it as an example of total idiocy. And then Hebestreit added that the Chancellor also stressed Germany's steadfast determination to support Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression as long as is necessary. So no change from the Germans, no rethinking of their line. Officials said Scholz and Putin had agreed to remain in contact, and we see that that is not the case, at least not from the Russian readout. Their aides would remain in contact. There's no clear evidence that the Russians and the Germans agreed that Scholz and Putin would. I mean, I'm not saying that they might not speak. The Russians have made it clear that they will speak to Western leaders, but they're not asking for or agreeing in advance to further conversations between Putin and Scholz. And, well, that basically is it. So what was this all about? We're also told that Scholz said in his conversation that he condemned Russian air attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, saying the war has brought death, suffering and destruction for almost 1,000 days. But of course, Putin is saying that it's your fault that that's happened. He also apparently made clear that the deployment of North Korean soldiers on combat missions in Russia represented a serious escalation and expansion of the conflict. The Russians will have shrugged their shoulders at that. So far, there's been no sign of any North Korean soldiers fighting, whether in Kursk region or anywhere else. And lastly, we're told by the Germans that Scholz stressed the long-term nature of Germany's support for Ukraine and told Putin he can't count on time being on his side, which as far as Putin is concerned, given that he's winning the war, that Trump has just been elected in the United States, and that Scholz is unlikely to remain Chancellor for very much longer, must also have seemed to Putin an incredibly fatuous comment. So anyway, what was the purpose of this call? Why did Scholz call Putin at this time when he has not called Putin for almost 2 years, for practically 2 years? it's not as if, as I said, Putin gave any concessions, moved a millimeter from Russia's positions. I'm going to suggest that the primary purpose of this call is to try to help Scholz in advance of the German elections in February. His opponent, he's Friedrich Merz, the leader of the union of the CDU and the CSU, has been taking a hard line on Ukraine. He's been floating ideas of Germany shifting its position towards support for Ukraine joining NATO. He's spoken publicly of supplying Taurus missiles to Ukraine and allowing Ukraine, or rather more precisely, assisting Ukraine to conduct deep strikes against Russia. So most probably, Scholz, who knows that these are unpopular positions with the German public, wants to try to position himself in advance of the elections as some sort of peace candidate, or if not exactly a peace candidate, because he's not prepared to compromise on any fundamental things, at least as the candidate who is going to resist further escalation. So what he's basically saying, and he's communicating this to the German people, is that, look, with me, you have a safe pair of hands. I'm going to stand up and resist this Russian bully, but at the same time, I'm not going to take foolish and unnecessary and reckless risks. I'm not going to plunge us into what could be an open-ended and disastrous conflict with the Russians that could easily escalate out of control by doing stupid things like inviting Ukraine to join NATO, or supplying the Ukrainians with Taurus missiles and encouraging them to engage in deep strikes against the Russians. So vote for me rather than Friedrich Merz. I will keep you safe, he will not. And if you follow German politics closely, you could see why that might be, I'm not saying a winning strategy. In my opinion, Scholz is such a discredited and exhausted figure that his re-election in February must be extremely unlikely, to put it mildly. But one could see why that might actually take support away from Merz, at least to some degree. Merz is, by all accounts, a powerful orator. He is an abrasive figure in German politics. He's not widely liked, at least that's my understanding. He's less popular than his own party, the CDU. Many Germans have doubts about him. They think that he is too confrontational altogether. And frankly, this approach that Scholz is perhaps proposing to take against Merz, that Merz is the crazy man who's going to land Germany into all kinds of problems, whereas Scholz is the steady pair of hands that will keep Germany out of trouble. Well, that approach might actually gain some traction over some German voters. I doubt, as I said, that it'll be enough to change the outcome of the election decisively. But bear in mind that what Scholz is probably maneuvering for at this time is not a situation where the SPD takes the lead in the next German government, but where Merz's support, the union's support, is limited so that Merz is forced into coalition arrangements, ultimately with the SPD itself. So I can see the strategy here. It's also possible that Scholz, aware of the fact that Donald Trump has just been elected to the presidency in the United States, is saying to himself and is going to say to the Germans, look, what Merz wants to do, which is basically escalate in Ukraine and make commitments to Ukraine about NATO's entry, all of that is going to go completely against what Donald Trump wants to do. Trump is talking about negotiations to end the war. Merz, on the contrary, wants to escalate and prolong it. That means, unlikely though that might seem, that I'm the better person to talk to Trump than Merz is. I'm someone who can find a way of speaking to Donald Trump. I'm more in tune with Trump's thinking than Merz is. And again, just possibly, that might win some traction in Germany, though I have to say that in Germany itself, the German people have been told such terrible things about Donald Trump that Trump really isn't very popular there. And I think that Scholz probably realizes that if he makes too much of that, and even gives the impression that he might be Trump's friend, that could actually lose him more votes rather than winning him any. So anyway, that is, I think, what Scholz is doing. He's weaving and preparing and positioning himself in advance of the German elections. There is no other explanation for this call than that. Scholz has often spoken about his willingness to speak to Putin, but that's because he knows that there have been many people in Germany who have been extremely unhappy about the course the German policy has taken since February 2022, and he has never wanted to break with those people completely. He is not, however, shifting on fundamentals. He's not rethinking his approach or Germany's approach. He's just maneuvering in the way that politicians do. And the Russians understand that. By the way, over the last few hours, the Russians, Peskov, that's Putin's spokesman, have made it absolutely clear, again, that in terms of setting up a telephone call, there's never been any indecision or doubt about doing so on the Russian side. The moment Scholz contacted them, or Scholz's office contacted them and told them that Scholz wanted to speak to Putin, they arranged the call right away. So again, it's not true that it's been the Russians who've been avoiding conversations or have been dragging their feet about them. It's the Germans. Now, having said all of this, many people are not happy that this call has happened. Scholz and his team are saying that before he called Putin, he consulted widely amongst the other G7 countries. That means, by the way, that he briefed the Biden administration, which is, of course, still in office in the United States, about what he intended to do. We don't know whether he also briefed Donald Trump or Trump's people, but that he did brief Biden and Macron and Starmer and all of the others, and that he also briefed the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians told him, don't do it. Zelensky didn't want him to call Putin at all. And in fact, Zelensky is angry about the call. He has made this very clear in a tweet and a message on X a post on X that he has published. Chancellor Scholz told me he planned to call Putin. His call, in my opinion, this is Zelensky's words, opens Pandora's box. There may now be other conversations and phone calls, just a lot of words. And this is exactly what Putin has long sought. It is critical for him to weaken his isolation. How anybody can say that Putin is isolated just a few weeks after Putin chaired a massive conference in Kazan, the BRICS conference in Kazan, attended by the president of China, the prime minister of India, the president of South Africa, and any number of other countries. Absolutely bewilders me, but according to Zelensky, Putin is isolated. It shows again how, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, it is merely the West that counts. They don't really take the rest of the world seriously. Anyway, goes on to say, and this is exactly what Putin has long sought, it is critical for him to weaken his isolation as well as Russia's isolation and hold mere talks that will lead nowhere. He has been doing this for decades, except, as I've discussed, that isn't true. The Russians and the Ukrainians came to an agreement, or a draft agreement, in Istanbul in April 2022. The Ukrainian negotiating team initialed it. There was all the indications were that they were going to agree to it. Zelensky at the time appeared to approve it. It isn't true that the Russians have been going through the motions of negotiation. They clearly sought a deal with the Ukrainians in April 2022. They negotiated deals with the Ukrainians in Minsk 1 in September 2014, and again in Minsk 2 in February 2015. So it isn't true. But anyway, I'm not going to dwell on the really unhappy diplomatic history in any detail from this time. This has allowed Russia to avoid making any change to its policies, effectively doing nothing, which has ultimately led to this war. We understand all the current challenges and we know what to do, and we wanted to make it clear there will be no Minsk 3. We need real peace. But he doesn't want Minsk 3, and nor do the Russians, by the way. But when Zelensky says that there will be no Minsk 3, what he basically means is that the only outcome that is acceptable to him is Russia's total capitulation. And his defense minister, Umerov, has said the same. There was an article which appeared about a day or so ago in the New York Times, which said that there is increasing talk in Kiev that what Ukraine needs to do is worry less about territory and more about long-term security for Ukraine, that security trumps return of territory. And Umerov came out almost immediately and said that the New York Times article was completely wrong, that as far as Ukraine was concerned, the issue of territory was identical to the issue of security. The only acceptable, just outcome was for Ukraine to recover all of its lost territories. There continues, by the way, to be a great deal of misunderstanding about the Ukrainian position. It's been suggested that Zelensky and his officials are beginning to shift their position from time to time. Very frequently over the last few months, Zelensky has talked about the fact that Ukraine is looking forward to a peace very soon. But he's always careful, when you read his words carefully, to see that he inserts in that the word just peace. And of course, from his perspective, a just peace is a peace in which Ukraine takes back possession of all of the territory it occupied before February 2014. So there's no real sign. I cannot see any true sign of any movement or shift in position from the Ukrainians. I think those who look for it are picking up noises, perhaps from wider Ukrainian society, from disaffected soldiers, from people of that kind. But overall, the Ukrainians have set their face completely against all and any negotiations. They continue to demand, they continue to insist on fulfillment of their maximal demands, the return of all of their territory, and only then, supposedly, can talks of any kind happen. And they're not the only people who say this. They continue to have supporters for that sort of stance in the West. Now, Boris Johnson, former British Prime Minister, who played an instrumental role, according to virtually all accounts that are not that don't originate with him, in wrecking the Istanbul process. Anyway, he's now tweeted, and he's just retweeted the words, Zelensky's words that I've just spoken of, and Johnson says this: "I'm afraid Zelensky's completely right. We risk drifting back to the ghastly Franco-German Normandy format, which treated Russia and Ukraine as equally valid interlocutors in a domestic squabble." This is his reaction to the call between Scholz and Putin. This is a shameful betrayal of the reality that Putin has launched a criminal and unjustifiable invasion while Ukraine is an entirely innocent party. The only way to bring this war to an end is massively and rapidly to strengthen the position of Ukraine. Now notice that Johnson here talks about reality. This is a shameful betrayal of the reality, whereas of course it is he ultimately who is engaging in the flight from reality. First of all, he denies that there was a domestic squabble, a domestic argument in Ukraine. He refuses to accept that there was a crisis in Ukraine in 2014, and that it is that crisis that ultimately is the cause of the war, and that the Western powers, including Britain, by the way, played a significant role in that crisis. But he also continues to say that the only way to bring this war to an end is massively and rapidly to strengthen the position of Ukraine. How? How is that going to be done? With more weapons? Weapons have been supplied to Ukraine in unlimited numbers, vast numbers, and the Ukrainians are losing the war despite that. Missile strikes on Russia, the Pentagon has already said that that's not going to change the outcome of the war, and that could lead to a dangerous escalation. Deployment of Western forces to Ukraine, well, that really would put us in a position where Western armies were fighting the Russians in a position, from a position, by the way, of disadvantage. And Biden himself, right at the start of this conflict, with Boris Johnson at that time publicly agreeing with him, saying that a situation where Americans and Russians were fighting each other, that would be World War III. So how does Johnson propose to massively and rapidly strengthen the position of Ukraine? How is that going to be done? Again, there is never any acknowledgement of the underlying strategic industrial realities. We see this with Scholz as well, when he says that Putin should not be under any illusion that time is on his side, when it is clear that it is Putin's armies that are advancing and Ukraine's which are retreating, when Russia continues to increase its armaments production and Western production of armaments is increasing at a far less rapid rate, so that the gap is actually growing. And by the way, the German media are reporting, I suspect falsely, that the Chinese are now also arming the Russians, supplying weapons to the Russians, in which case, of course, the gap is going to increase further still, given the immensely greater capacity over any of the other players that the Chinese have. So, where is the reality? The reality argues against Johnson's position. If we want to talk about a shameful betrayal of realities, it has been always by him and by people who argue with him. But unfortunately, the other reality we must face is that there are a great many people still in influential positions, especially in Europe, including, by the way, in Germany, who continue to think in the kind of way that Johnson does. So, to repeat again, I see no sign that the Ukrainians are prepared to trade territory for security. I see no evidence of the Ukrainians being prepared to take any of these steps. Of course, as I said, you will find some people on the margins of political life in Ukraine and many more people within Ukrainian society who long for an end to the war and who would be prepared to make these sort of concessions. But it is foolish to imagine that this is in any way the policy of Ukraine. I mentioned Umerov, the defense minister, who's also rejected outright these ideas. It is worth pointing out that Umerov is, as I understand it, a Crimean Tatar. So from his point of view, for Ukraine to give up its claim to Crimea would be for him to accept that he has no prospect of ever returning to what he doubtless see as his home. But putting aside Umerov's own personal feelings, I've no doubt that there is no doubt at all that he speaks for what remains Ukrainian policy, and those who claim that that policy has changed on the evidence of what the Ukrainians are saying is simply wrong. Now, I say that because there's also been an article in Politica which says that Trump threatens to be good for Ukraine, actually. And the article goes on to say the secret relief in some European quarters and even Kiev, that Donald Trump might bring the war to a close, and he's far more likely to get a better deal from Moscow. And the fact that, and then the article goes on to say Trump's re-election has now clearly highlighted the West's folly in promising to stick with this war until Ukraine returns to its 1991 borders. Some leaders had also promised speedy NATO membership, though that was never likely in the foreseeable future, if at all, with or without Trump in the White House. The mantra that Western powers would back Ukraine for as long as it takes was always suspect too, as elections inevitably roll around and have consequences. So was the frequent assertion that no one should push Ukraine into talks because whoever pays the piper calls the tune. And now, for all the overt hand wringing over the US election and what it means for Ukraine, some Ukrainian quarters, even Kiev for that matter, are now secretly relieved by the prospect of Trump bringing the war to an end. And if he's successful, European leaders and American hawks will have an alibi, and President Zelensky will have cover from likely angry frontline Ukrainian soldiers. They'll all blame Trump for the broken promises, for the loss of Donbass and Crimea's continued annexation, because that's what it will take to ink a deal. That and an agreement that Ukraine won't be joining NATO. Neutrality will be a firm concession Moscow will demand. Some call this an ugly deal, and it is. It will undermine Western credibility, and it's a crying shame we are where we are. But if you run down your military forces in arms production for decades, fail to draw enforceable red lines, and don't ask hard questions before making promises or work out what it will take, this is what happens. And then there is no other alternative short of a forever war or Western powers becoming combatants themselves, or at least putting their economies on a war footing to supply Ukraine with much more than they currently are. That's the cold reality. And according to a Republican foreign policy expert familiar with Zelensky and his circle, Kiev understands this. Asking to remain anonymous in order to speak candidly, Kiev now reckons Trump may well turn out to be a better option than Kiev was, because Harris would have continued the same policy of supporting Ukraine. Trump, by not doing so, will enable the Ukrainians to escape from the trap that they and the Europeans, and to a great extent the Americans themselves, have boxed themselves into. Well, I would like to believe all of this, but let me repeat again, none of this bears any resemblance to the language that is coming out from Kiev. If the Americans expect the Ukrainians to sit down with the Russians and negotiate these sort of terms, loss of territory, acknowledgement that the 4 regions belong to Russia, permanent Ukrainian neutrality, then I'm afraid they're going to have, on the basis of what the Ukrainians say, to change the leadership in Kiev, because there is no other way. Now, I say that it's also important to remember that Russian terms from this point are going to be harsher still. I want to go back briefly to Lavrov's interview that with the Russian media outlet, which I discussed yesterday, because amongst other things, Lavrov said this: the EU has become a kind of NATO in the military political sense. And he said that talking specifically about Ukraine. Now, the Russians up to now, and officially still, have said that they do not object to Ukraine entering the EU, because the EU is an economic, not a military political project. Here we have Lavrov saying something completely different. Ukraine is, as far as Lavrov is concerned, a military political project. Medvedev has said the same thing. I cannot help but think that this reflects a further shift from the Russian position, a further hardening of the Russian position that the Russians took in Istanbul. Whereas in April 2022, they were still prepared to agree to Ukrainian entry into the EU. Now, based on what Lavrov and Medvedev are publicly saying, I don't think they will. I'm going to say further that if Putin, in order to end the war, decides that he's still going to agree to terms whereby Ukraine is enabled to join the EU, he risks finding himself at odds with what I suspect will be a significant majority of the key figures in Russia's top decision-making body, the Security Council. So, we're going to have a hardening of Russian terms. Is it plausible that the Ukrainians, at least this government, are going to accept them? I think not. In fact, I'm going to go further, and I am going to say that all of these maneuvers, the fact that Scholz telephoned Putin, got his head chewed off and said nothing of any real substance, of any real interest, that was in any way new, that Zelensky continues to insist and gets very angry when anyone else suggests otherwise, that Ukraine will recover all its territories going all the way back to what it had before 2022, February 2014. I think all of this, given how implacable the Russians have become, all of this tells me that the best policy for Donald Trump to follow is to keep as much distance between himself and the conflict in Ukraine as possible. Dial down economic and military support to Ukraine. Tell the Ukrainians it's for them to sort out and for the Europeans to sort out as well. And tell the Europeans and the Ukrainians that the United States has other more serious and important things, important to itself, that is, to occupy its time. That, it seems to me, is far and away the best policy for the Americans to follow. Wasting time arguing with people like Zelensky, trying to get Scholz or Macron or Merz, not to mention the British, on side with a negotiation. After all that has happened, I'm not even starting with Ursula, it's something that no American administration should sensibly, at this time, want to get itself involved in. That is my clear view. I've expressed it many times. I think if American aid basically stops, then that might concentrate the minds in Kiev and Brussels and Berlin and even London. But short of that, I think that they will all spin out the process of negotiation as long as they can, as they try to keep the Americans committed and even draw them more deeply in. And I think that is not what Trump should want, and I hope that that is what he will understand he shouldn't do. Well, that ends my discussion of the Scholz-Putin call. Now, I'm going to touch on two things very quickly, though I do intend to return to them in more detail in my next program. Firstly, the Financial Times is suggesting that the Trump administration, the forthcoming Trump administration's plan with respect to Iran is not to wage outright war against it. In other words, they may actually tell the Israelis that the United States does not support a full-scale war against Iran, but rather to impose maximum pressure against Iran by tightening sanctions even further, by returning to the policy of Trump's first term of trying to engineer an economic strangulation of Iran so as to collapse its political system and government. That failed in Trump's first term. I predict it would fail if attempted again. I think it also overlooks the fundamental change in the geopolitical landscape, the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the relationship between the other BRIC states, China, Russia, and India, and Iran also. So I don't think that will be a successful policy. But in the immediate term, it might put a brake on proposals for a war between Israel and Iran. I intend to return much more in depth to a discussion of this in my next program. This is obviously a major topic to discuss. The second thing I wanted to say is that, of course, the war itself continues. I don't have time in this program to conduct the in-depth discussion of the military situation in Ukraine that I had planned to do. But suffice to say that the pieces on the board are moving forward, and they are Russian pieces. So firstly, we now have more news that does appear to confirm that the Russians control a significant part of Kupiansk, the part of Kupiansk east of the Oskol River. The report suggests that the Russians were able to take advantage of another botched rotation of Ukrainian troops, that a Ukrainian military unit that had become exhausted was being withdrawn from the front lines to be replaced by another unit, a territorial defense brigade, by the way, which is hardly equal, I would have thought, to the pressures of the frontline battlefields in this area. The Russians got wind of the fact, took advantage of it, and conducted a lightning offensive in which they were able to capture a significant section of Kupiansk. It's happened before. It happened at Ocheretino. It's happened in various other places. It's a sign of how exhausted the Ukrainian army has become and overstretched the Ukrainian army has become. That this very same thing, is repeating itself time and time again, and it appears to have happened in Kupiansk. Anyway, the Russians do seem to be inside Kupiansk. They've consolidated. There are claims that they're preparing to resume the attack in Kupiansk, and that perhaps at some point over the next couple of weeks, the whole of Kupiansk, east of the Oskol River, will fall fully under their control. There are further film and photographic evidence which appears to confirm that the Russians now control the greater part of Chasiv Yar. There's pictures of Ukrainian drones attacking Russian soldiers in locations where nobody had imagined that the Russians would be. So it does seem as if the Russians are within measurable distance now of completing this long and complicated battle for Chasiv Yar, which, by the way, they see as an extension of the battle for Bakhmut. The Russians also are continuing to mount further offensives in Toretsk. They've resumed their advances in Toretsk, and their drones are very, very active on the Ukrainian supply roads into Toretsk. The plan clearly being to exhaust Ukrainian supplies and to prevent the Ukrainians from further reinforcing. If we are talking about the critically important area of Kurakhovo, here the situation for the Ukrainians is nothing short of catastrophic. In fact, the TASS news agency says that a substantial Ukrainian force is now at risk of complete encirclement inside Kurakhovo itself. The Russians have continued to close the ring around Kurakhovo, assisted by this obviously deeply mistaken decision that someone in Ukraine made to destroy the Kurakhovo Dam, which has flooded some of the exit roads to Kurakhovo. So the situation there looks very difficult for the Ukrainians. Ilinka, on the northern bank of the Kurakhovo reservoir, is firmly under Russian control. The Russians continue to advance in that area. Soon, the whole territory north of the Kurakhovo reservoir will be fully controlled by the Russians. South of the Kurakhovo reservoir and south of Kurakhovo itself, the Russians appear to have captured the village of Danye. Ukrainian troops in the villages of Yelizavetivka and other places further south still, are now apparently retreating from these territories, lest they be completely surrounded by the Russians. What we're looking at are rearguard actions by the Ukrainians. And suffice to say again that the whole situation in Kurakovo is deteriorating. The Russians continue to advance, conduct a very complicated operation to surround the fortified town of Velikaya Novosilka, west of Ugleda. In fact, the battle for Velika Novosilka bears some resemblance to the battle for Ugleda, in the sense that rather than launch a direct assault on Velikaya Novosilka, the Russians are gradually cutting off the supply roads and making it impossible for the garrison in Velikaya Novosilka to hold positions there, so that presumably at some point in the next few weeks, the Ukrainians are going to have to retreat from this important fortified town, potentially opening the routes to the Dnieper. And the Russians have gradually begun what looks like some kind of advance in Zaporozhye region towards Orekhov and Gulyapolye, two important villages, two important towns, the two towns that form the linchpin of the Ukrainian defense in Zaporozhye. Though it's difficult, for me at least, for the moment, to get a complete sense of what exactly it is that the Russians are doing. And lastly, last of all, there is clear evidence of some kind of big Russian raid right up in the northwest of Kursk region. The Russians seem to have conducted a big raid deep into Chernigov region. This is an area to the northwest of Sumy region, closer, significantly closer to Kiev itself. And it's difficult to know exactly what the Russians are doing here. There's some suggestions that the Russians are aiming to actually occupy some villages and to gain control of some places in Chernigov region. My own sense, again, is that this is more a raid, a reconnaissance in force, and maybe a raid, but perhaps it's also intended to unnerve and unsettle the Ukrainians. I've said in many programs that Zelensky is very nervous of anything that might threaten Kiev itself, and it could be intended, rather than to capture territory in this area, it could be intended instead to persuade the Ukrainians, to persuade Zelensky to order more troops to be diverted to defend the capital, Kiev, weakening still further the front lines in Donbass, where the major Russian offensive is taking place. Lastly, Kursk region, there's been less news over the last couple of days, but it does seem as if significant bodies of Ukrainian troops have been surrounded by the Russians in the forests. The pocket, the Kursk pocket, is by my estimate now around 40% of its maximum size. The Russians have recaptured around 60% of it. Maybe others will push back on that. But anyway, the Russians appear to have pushed the Ukrainians significantly back in the Kursk pocket. And now it looks to me as if they're busy clearing the various isolated groups of Ukrainians that have been left behind and are now behind the Russian lines. The Russians are working to round them all up. So that is my very brief account today of what is going on the battlefronts. I will return to this hopefully tomorrow Though, of course, there may be other events which will again throw me off course. But anyway, this is where I finish today's program. So let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, you can, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. To repeat once more, I'm off to Hungary tomorrow. I'll see when and how I can do my next video for tomorrow. But one way or the other, I will be back. And until then, have a very good day.